The 1940s were a dangerous decade to drive. Cars looked strong and solid, but most were death traps on wheels. Built with war-era materials, rush designs, and zero safety in mind, they were heavy, unstable, and brutal in crashes. No seatbelts, no protection, just cold steel and bad luck. Here are the 10 dumbest and deadliest cars of the 1940s that killed many and proved style meant nothing without safety. The Chevrolet Fleetline, produced between 1941 and 1952, remains one of the most haunting examples of how beauty and danger can coexist in a single machine. It was a car of elegance, grace, and post-war optimism, a symbol of American confidence reborn after the Great Depression and World War II. With its fastback styling, sweeping curves, and chrome-laden presence, the Fleetline looked every bit like a bullet gliding through the streets. Unfortunately, that visual metaphor was far too accurate. In motion and, more crucially, in collisions, the Fleetline acted less like a car and more like a projectile, fast, rigid, and utterly unforgiving. Beneath its handsome sheet metal was a brutal truth. It was a death trap dressed in beauty. The Fleetline's body, especially in its early 1940s and immediate post-war versions, was built on a structure that barely deserved to be called a frame. Chevrolet engineers, still relying on pre-war technology and designs conceived before the concept of automotive safety truly existed, prioritized looks and manufacturing simplicity over integrity. The result was a car whose body could flex and twist violently under stress. During crashes, this flexibility worked against the driver and passengers. Instead of crumpling in controlled ways to absorb energy, the steel body simply deformed catastrophically, transferring almost all of the impact directly into the cabin. In head-on collisions, drivers were often hurled forward into the hard metal dashboard, their bodies colliding with knobs, dials, and the notorious solid steel steering column, a rigid spear aimed straight at the chest. There were no seatbelts, no airbags, no padding. The steering column didn't collapse or give way, it simply impaled. Adding to this was the Fleetline's outdated suspension and braking systems, both borrowed from late 1930s designs. Its drum brakes, while sufficient for the slower speeds of the pre-war era, faded rapidly under repeated use. On long descents or highway driving, something American motorists increasingly embraced in the post-war years, the brakes could lose nearly all effectiveness, leaving drivers helpless as the heavy, all-steel car barreled forward uncontrollably. The suspension, designed for comfort on rough roads, was soft and unsteady at high speeds. Combined with vague, unresponsive steering, the Fleetline became difficult to control during emergency maneuvers. What felt like floating elegance at 40 miles per hour turned into deadly instability at 70. Owners and mechanics of the period often remarked that the Fleetline was built like a tank, a phrase meant as praise, which, in practice, was tragically misleading. Tanks are meant to absorb punishment. The Fleetline, by contrast, transferred it directly to its occupants. In side impacts, the doors provided almost no resistance, and the thin roof pillars could collapse completely if the car rolled over. Many accidents from the late 1940s and early 1950s involving Fleetlines ended with severe injuries, not because of excessive speed, but because the car's interior was essentially a steel cage without restraint systems. Survivors often described being thrown violently across the cabin, heads striking metal surfaces, limbs broken by the sheer force of deceleration. Ironically, the Fleetline's design made it a status symbol among middle-class Americans. It was sleek, futuristic, and imbued with the streamlined ideals of the jet age. Its fastback shape suggested motion even when parked. It was the kind of car that soldiers returning from war dreamed of owning, a visual promise of prosperity and modernity. But for all its glamour, it carried the engineering DNA of an era before anyone thought seriously about crash safety. To Chevrolet's credit, the company wasn't unique in this failure. Few manufacturers in the early 1950s understood the deadly consequences of rigid steering systems, unpadded dashboards, or weak structural reinforcements.
The problem was that the Fleetline, with its combination of heavy mass, high speeds, and obsolete structure, amplified every danger inherent in the era's cars. Mechanically, the Fleetline was reliable and easy to maintain, which made it popular among working families well into the 1950s. But its simplicity was its charm and its curse. There were no redundant safety systems, no reinforcement points, no crumple zones, just raw, unyielding steel. In a collision, this simplicity became lethal. Drivers often didn't survive what would later be considered moderate impacts. A front-end collision at 40 miles per hour could result in the steering column penetrating the driver's chest, while the front passengers were thrown forward into the dashboard or windshield with devastating results. The Fleetline's heavy, rigid body might have survived the crash externally, but its occupants rarely did. By modern standards, the Fleetline is a chilling reminder of how far automotive safety has come. Today, we marvel at its curves and chrome, its timeless Art Deco lines, and the nostalgic charm it brings to car shows and museums. But it's easy to forget that behind that shimmering facade lies the ghost of an era when style mattered more than survival. The Fleetline's legacy is therefore double-edged. It represents both the triumph of post-war American design and the deadly ignorance of pre-safety engineering. It was a car that promised elegance, speed, and freedom, yet delivered danger, fragility, and pain. In a cruel twist of irony, the very car that symbolized progress in the 1940s became, by modern understanding, one of the clearest examples of how beauty can hide fatal flaws.
The Ford Super Deluxe of 1941 to 1948 stands as one of the most striking examples of how the illusion of strength could mask a terrifying fragility. It was the car of victory, the symbol of post-war America, bold, bright, and built with confidence after years of wartime austerity that made buyers believe they were safe simply by virtue of weight and thickness. But beneath that reassuring facade lay a cruel irony. The Super Deluxe wasn't the fortress Ford promised. It was a beautifully polished execution chamber on wheels, an unforgiving relic from an age when no one truly understood what safety meant. Ford engineers in the early 1940s designed the Super Deluxe with the same philosophy that guided nearly every car maker of the era. Make it strong, make it heavy, make it look substantial. The concept of controlled deformation, crumple zones, collapsible steering columns, padded dashboards didn't yet exist. The result was a car that could take an external beating while transferring every ounce of that destructive energy directly into its occupants. The Super Deluxe's body-on-frame construction was stiff to a fault. In a head-on collision, instead of bending or dispersing impact energy, the frame stayed rigid, forcing the body to buckle inward, collapsing the cabin space and turning the steering column into a deadly spear. The steering wheel itself, a wide and elegantly thin-rimmed piece of metal and bakelite, was deadly in the most literal sense. With no collapsible mechanism or give, it transmitted force directly to the driver's chest. In moderate speed crashes, 35 to 40 miles per hour, the steering shaft could impale the driver, crushing ribs and puncturing lungs or the heart. Ford's marketing slogan, "Built like a fortress," was technically accurate. The Super Deluxe was built with the solidity of a fortress wall. But just as a fortress traps those inside when it collapses, this car offered no escape once the accident began. The doors, mounted with primitive latches, had a grim reputation for flying open under impact. Passengers were often ejected through open doorways or shattered glass. The roof structure, lacking any reinforcement, could cave in during rollovers. Inside, the interior was a museum of metallic hazards. The dashboard that gleamed with chromed steel and artful trim was as hard as an anvil. Every knob, switch, and instrument was made of sharp-edged metal or brittle bakelite. In a crash, these decorations became projectiles or blunt instruments, breaking teeth, cracking skulls, and slashing skin. Even the radio and clock housings were mounted in ways that pointed directly at the front passengers. The windshield, a single pane of non-laminated safety glass in the early models, could shatter into dagger-like shards, turning a frontal impact into a shower of lethal splinters. The post-war models, sold from 1946 to 1948, were essentially the same pre-war cars with a few cosmetic updates. During this period, materials were scarce, so Ford relied heavily on designs carried over from 1941. Wartime technology had advanced in areas like metallurgy and aerodynamics, but not in civilian safety. Civilians, eager for new cars after years of shortages, didn't care. They wanted luxury and motion, and the Super Deluxe provided both. Powered by Ford's flathead V8, it was smooth, quiet, and reassuringly powerful. But it also had vague steering, minimal braking power, and suspension that wallowed at speed. Drivers who lost control discovered just how little stability the big car had. Its heavy front end made it prone to plowing straight ahead in turns, while the narrow bias-ply tires lost traction unpredictably. One of the darker realities of the Super Deluxe era was that accidents often looked survivable until rescuers examined the inside. The exterior damage would appear mild, with the chrome grille and fenders still recognizable, but the cabin would tell a different story. Steering column bent backward through the driver's chest, dashboard crushed inward, passengers hurled against metal structures. Doctors of the late 1940s often called such cases steering wheel fatalities. The idea that the car's own design killed its occupants was rarely discussed publicly. Automakers, including Ford, promoted the illusion that heavier cars were safer, that solid steel protection equaled security. In truth, the Super Deluxe's mass only increased the forces acting on human bodies during impact. There were other sinister details. The door latches, for instance, were prone to failure under side loads. In a T-bone collision, the door could rip away entirely, and unbelted passengers, seatbelts were still years away, would be flung out. Those who stayed inside fared little better, as the sharp door handles and metal window frames became jagged weapons. In rollover accidents, the large, flat roof, with virtually no structural reinforcement, often caved in completely, flattening the passenger compartment. Survivors of such crashes described the horrifying sensation of being trapped under tons of steel, unable to move or breathe. Yet despite these flaws, the Ford Super Deluxe sold in staggering numbers. It was stylish, reliable, and available at a time when America was desperate for new cars. To many families, it was the first car they owned after the war, a symbol of peace and prosperity. It carried soldiers home, newlyweds to their honeymoons, and families on their first post-war road trips. In photos, it looks dignified and confident, a machine that defined an era. But for safety engineers and historians, it also represents a chilling snapshot of a time when no one thought about survivability, when the idea of a safe car simply didn't exist. Today, collectors cherish the Super Deluxe for its vintage charm and mechanical simplicity, and rightly so. It remains a gorgeous piece of 1940s design, the long fenders, the soft lines, the way the sunlight gleams off its chrome. But every time one is restored or taken to a car show, it carries the ghosts of a different reality, of drivers who believed they were surrounded by strength, only to discover that strength was a lie. The Ford Super Deluxe, for all its beauty and success, remains a grim monument to the age before safety, when a car could promise protection, deliver death, and still be celebrated as progress.
The Plymouth Special Deluxe, produced from 1946 to 1950, was one of the most beloved American cars of its day. A dependable, middle-class family sedan that symbolized everything the country wanted to believe after the war: stability, progress, and normalcy. It was a car that filled driveways across small towns and big cities alike, bringing soldiers home from overseas and ushering in a new era of American prosperity. But beneath that reassuring image of chrome, comfort, and confidence was a far more troubling truth. The Special Deluxe was a car built for an era that hadn't yet learned what safety meant. It was solid, yes, but brutally so. A machine that treated momentum as beauty and physics as an afterthought. In a collision, that beauty turned deadly fast. The design itself was a carryover from pre-war engineering. Although the world had changed drastically between 1941 and 1946, Plymouth simply dusted off its old blueprints and started production again. It had elegant rounded fenders, a proud vertical grille, and the kind of solid steel construction Americans associated with quality. But this strength was deceptive. The car's ladder-type frame and body-on-frame architecture were extremely rigid, offering no absorption of impact energy in a crash. The result was simple but horrifying. In a head-on collision, the car stayed intact, and the passengers absorbed the entire force. The front of the car would barely deform, but the steering wheel would slam into the driver's chest like a battering ram. The steering system, in fact, was one of the car's most notorious weaknesses. With its recirculating ball setup and large, slow ratio, it gave drivers little sense of control, especially at higher speeds. Loose steering was a generous term. At 50 miles per hour, the car often wandered unpredictably across lanes, forcing constant correction. In the event of a crash, the rigid steering column acted like a spear, transmitting the full force of the impact directly to the driver's torso. Safety engineers who examined these cars decades later were shocked at the severity of the potential injuries from even moderate-speed collisions. It wasn't unusual for accident victims to suffer massive internal trauma simply because of the design of the steering shaft. Then there were the brakes. Drum brakes on all four wheels, barely adequate even by the standards of the late 1940s. They faded badly on long downhill grades, often requiring drivers to downshift just to avoid complete loss of braking power. When wet, the drums lost nearly all effectiveness. Combined with bias-ply tires that had poor grip and a high center of gravity, the Special Deluxe was prone to both skidding and rollovers. Emergency maneuvers were almost impossible to execute safely. Drivers who tried to avoid sudden obstacles often found the car lurching uncontrollably, with its heavy nose plowing forward while the rear end tried to swing around. The tall, narrow stance meant that once it began to tip, it rarely recovered. Inside, the Special Deluxe was designed for comfort, but not for survival. The bench seats were broad and inviting, upholstered in thick cloth or leather, with no seatbelts of any kind. Seatbelts were still considered unnecessary and even unpatriotic at the time, as if to suggest a lack of faith in American engineering. During collisions, however, those same wide, flat seats became execution platforms. Occupants were flung forward into the dashboard, windshield, or even ejected through doors that often burst open on impact. The dashboard itself was an unforgiving sheet of metal trimmed with chrome and knobs that could slice open a face or crush a skull. There was no padding anywhere, and the large steering wheel hub became a blunt weapon in the driver's chest. The windshield, made of laminated glass in later models, was still hazardous. It could shatter into long, sharp splinters, often embedding themselves in passengers. Side windows, which were not safety glass at all in earlier versions, exploded into flying shards during accidents. Even minor fender benders resulted in lacerations and concussions. And if the car rolled, something that happened all too often due to its high center of gravity, the roof structure was little more than decorative. It could collapse under its own weight, crushing passengers inside with terrifying ease. Yet, despite all of these dangers, the Plymouth Special Deluxe was seen as a triumph of post-war reliability. Mechanics loved it because it was simple, durable, and easy to repair. Its flathead inline-six engine was nearly indestructible, capable of running for years with minimal maintenance. Rural America adored it for its toughness on bad roads, and city dwellers admired its quiet comfort and smooth ride. Families trusted it, not realizing that the same simplicity that made it easy to fix also made it incredibly unsafe. Mechanics joked grimly that the car didn't need seatbelts. You'd be dead before you can use them. A dark truth disguised as humor. Owners often described the car as a tank, and they meant it as praise. It felt solid, substantial, reassuringly heavy compared to the light European imports beginning to appear. But that tank-like feel came at a cost. Tanks are designed to survive external punishment, not to protect fragile humans inside from violent motion. The Plymouth's immense rigidity meant that in any significant crash, all the kinetic energy stopped with the passengers. In a modern car, energy is dissipated through engineered deformation. In the Special Deluxe, it was transferred directly to the human body. There were other quirks that made it dangerous in subtle ways. The mechanical drum handbrake was mounted under the dashboard, hard to reach in emergencies. The fuel tank sat exposed at the rear, vulnerable to rupturing and rear-end collisions. The headlights, though stylishly integrated into the fenders, were dim by today's standards, limiting visibility at night. Combine all that with loose steering, poor brakes, and bias-ply tires, and you had a recipe for disaster on the open highway. Still, the Plymouth Special Deluxe endures in memory as one of those cars that defined its generation. It carried newlyweds, soldiers returning from war, and entire families on cross-country adventures. It was photographed in front of drive-ins, diners, and new suburban homes. It represented hope and recovery. But behind that bright image lay the darker side of early automotive history, when strength was confused for safety, and when the car that symbolized American resilience could, in an instant, destroy the very lives it carried. Today, restored examples gleam under the sun at classic car shows, their chrome shining and their engines purring like they did 75 years ago. But safety engineers who study them see something else entirely. A beautiful relic from an era of ignorance, a machine built with heart, but without mercy. The Plymouth Special Deluxe was dependable, yes, but it was also a cruel reminder that reliability means nothing when physics turns against you.
The Hudson Commodore, produced between 1941 and 1952, was a grand symbol of American luxury at a time when the automobile industry was redefining itself after the Great Depression and World War II. It was elegant, commanding, and beautifully proportioned, a sleek Art Deco sculpture of chrome and steel. For many Americans, owning a Commodore meant you had truly made it. You were part of the new middle class, gliding through post-war prosperity in a machine that promised refinement and stability. But beneath that graceful body was a car that could betray its driver in the most brutal way imaginable. The Commodore was strong, but dangerously so. A car that confused structural innovation with safety, and that made its greatest selling point, the famous step-down unibody, one of its most lethal features. Hudson's step-down design was revolutionary. Instead of sitting high on a traditional frame, passengers rode inside the perimeter of the car's frame, effectively stepping down into the body. This gave the Commodore an incredibly low center of gravity for its era, making it stable in corners and allowing Hudson to boast that their cars hugged the road. It was a clever marketing angle, and partially true. The Commodore did handle better than many of its tall, floaty contemporaries. But the design also had a deadly flaw. The rigid, welded steel structure that formed the floor and lower body had almost no ability to absorb impact forces. When collisions occurred, the unibody shell didn't crumble or deform, it transmitted all the energy of the crash directly to the occupants. The very thing that made the car feel solid in motion made it catastrophic in an accident. Drivers who crashed a Commodore didn't just hit something, they felt as if the car itself had struck back. The floor pan and doors, heavily reinforced but lacking any energy-dissipating structure, became part of a massive steel box that trapped its passengers. The result was a brutal form of internal trauma. One safety inspector in the early 1950s remarked that, quote, "The car held together perfectly. It's the people inside who broke." Survivors of Commodore wrecks often describe the sensation as being hit by your own car from the inside, a grim and accurate summary of what that unyielding construction really meant in practice. The Commodore's massive weight only made matters worse. Depending on the model and engine, it tipped the scales at well over 3,700 pounds, a heavy machine by any measure for its time. Stopping it required patience and prayer. The brakes, still drum type on all four wheels, were often overwhelmed by the car's mass.
They faded quickly under repeated use, and when they did, the car's size and inertia gave drivers almost no chance of avoiding whatever was in front of them. Its steering, too, was ponderous and vague. The manual steering box was geared for comfort, not precision, requiring nearly 5 full turns lock to lock. Drivers described the feeling as guiding a barge, and in narrow roads or in emergencies, it could be a nightmare. In an era before seatbelts or padded dashboards, the interior of the Hudson Commodore was a polished death trap. The dashboard, though beautiful with its Art Deco instrumentation and chromed accents, was an expanse of metal. The steering wheel was a solid steel ring connected to a rigid column, one that in a frontal crash became a spear aimed directly at the driver's chest. There were no collapsible mechanisms, no energy-absorbing materials, no restraint systems to slow a body's momentum. The seats were wide and plush, inviting comfort, but they offered no lateral support or safety of any kind. In a crash, passengers were flung forward violently into the dash, windshield, or the very steering wheel that was supposed to guide them. Visibility, too, was limited. The thick pillars that supported the sleek roofline created blind spots, and the heavy, slow manual windows made escape difficult after an accident. The doors were prone to jamming due to body flex during impacts, trapping passengers inside as fuel and oil leaked dangerously. Though Hudson engineers had prided themselves on the tight fit of the step-down structure, it also meant that in serious collisions, the car could deform just enough to prevent anyone from getting out. Firefighters and tow operators from the late 1940s and early 1950s often dreaded cutting open a Commodore. Its thick steel resisted tools, and its tight seams made extraction slow and difficult. Mechanics and drivers often commented that the Hudson drove like a tank, and in many ways that was an apt comparison. It had an unyielding solidity, a feeling of invincibility that appealed to the driver's sense of confidence. But, like a tank, it was designed to take punishment externally, not to protect the delicate human body within from sudden deceleration. The front crumpled very little, meaning the deceleration forces on impact were transmitted through the firewall and directly into the passenger compartment. In high-speed collisions, passengers didn't just collide with the interior collided with them. The car's handling reputation was equally mixed. Hudson Advertising bragged about the Commodore's low-slung stance and excellent balance, but in practice, the car's sheer bulk made it clumsy. At high speeds, its unassisted steering demanded constant correction, and the suspension, while smooth, was soft enough to induce dangerous sway in corners. Combine that with bias-ply tires that lost grip easily and braking distances that could stretch into hundreds of feet, and it became clear that the Commodore's road-hugging ability was more illusion than fact. In the event of a rollover, which was rare but devastating, the strong but inflexible roof structure often crushed inward with little resistance. The same rigidity that made the body durable in minor bumps became fatal under heavy loads. With no roof reinforcement or roll cage, the cabin collapsed like a tin box. And since seatbelts were non-existent, occupants were often thrown violently into the collapsing structure itself. Despite all this, the Hudson Commodore was admired in its day. It offered one of the first truly integrated unibody chassis, and its engineering influenced the next decade of automotive design. It was ahead of its time in many ways, but far behind it in others. Owners praised its comfort and quiet ride, its powerful straight-eight engine, and its ability to cruise for hours without complaint. It was the kind of car people took on long cross-country trips, unaware that a single mistake could turn that trip into a tragedy. There's a certain irony to how Hudson promoted its innovation as a safety feature. Step-down design, they claimed, gave passengers a lower center of gravity and more stability, implying greater safety. But in reality, it turned the Commodore into a steel coffin in high-speed collisions. The irony wasn't lost on later automotive historians, who often noted that Hudson built one of the most advanced and dangerous unibodies of the early post-war era. Today, the Commodore remains a beautifully tragic piece of automotive history, admired for its craftsmanship, lamented for its flaws. Restored examples shimmer at car shows, their paint and chrome immaculate, their interiors lush and nostalgic. But anyone who knows the truth about these cars understands what lurks beneath that beauty. A car's structure was both its genius and its curse. It was a machine that promised luxury, delivered innovation, and hid lethality within its welded seams. The Hudson Commodore was not just a dangerous car. It was a reminder of a time when automakers believed that heavy steel and elegant design equaled safety. It stood proudly in showrooms as a symbol of progress, but on the road, it could turn in an instant from a monument of engineering into a weapon of its own making.
The Studebaker Champion, built from 1939 through 1952, is often remembered as one of America's most stylish and forward-thinking pre-war and post-war automobiles. Sleek, modern, and distinctively streamlined, it stood apart from the stodgy Fords and Chevrolets of its day. It was light, efficient, and futuristic, the kind of car that made people believe the future had finally arrived in their driveway. But what most didn't realize was that this elegant machine carried a terrible flaw beneath its shimmering sheet metal. Behind the proud Champion name and aerodynamic curves lay a dangerously rigid design, a car that sacrificed safety at the altar of innovation, turning its own structure into a deadly weapon in the event of a crash. The Champion was introduced in 1939 as Studebaker's answer to the Great Depression's lingering economic strain. It was smaller and lighter than most American cars, designed to give ordinary families affordable transportation with style. To achieve that lightness, Studebaker engineers used thinner gauge steel throughout the body, a revolutionary move at the time. The car's body panels were so thin that mechanics joked you could dent them with a hard stare. While this helped improve fuel economy and performance, it came at the expense of structural integrity. In an accident, the thin steel offered little resistance, buckling like tinfoil and transmitting the shock directly into the cabin. The car's rigid ladder frame and minimal body reinforcement compounded the danger. Unlike later unibody designs that allowed some degree of controlled deformation, the Champion's chassis was brutally stiff. It didn't absorb impacts, it reflected them. When the car struck another vehicle or stationary object, the energy of the collision didn't dissipate through the bodywork. It went straight into the passenger compartment. This was particularly catastrophic in frontal crashes, where the rigid frame acted like a battering ram, while the thin firewall folded inward toward the driver's legs. Many accident reports from the late 1940s mention crushed femurs and shattered knees caused by the engine block being forced rearward during impact. The engine placement made matters even worse. Studebaker engineers trying to maximize interior space pushed the engine far forward and slightly higher than in most contemporary vehicles. This design meant that during the head-on collision, the heavy inline-six engine had nowhere to go but backward, directly into the driver's compartment. There was no reinforced firewall, no underbody subframe, and no designed breakaway mounts to absorb the energy. In severe crashes, the engine could shift backwards by several inches, crushing the firewall and forcing the steering column into the driver's chest or legs. Survivors of these wrecks often described their injuries in gruesome detail, with some saying the front end folded like a knife toward the cabin. Adding to the peril, the Champion was built long before the advent of laminated safety glass. Its windshield and side windows were made from ordinary tempered glass that shattered into sharp shards during impacts. Drivers and passengers were frequently lacerated by flying glass, and because the car's cabin was narrow and compact, those shards had nowhere to go but directly into the occupants' faces and arms. One period crash investigator from the early 1950s noted grimly that, in a Studebaker wreck, you didn't just hit the dashboard, it hit you back, and the glass finished what the steel started. Inside, the Champion's cabin, though handsome in its simplicity, was another danger zone. The dashboard was a solid slab of steel painted in glossy enamel, dotted with hard chrome knobs and switches that could impale or slice through skin on impact. The steering column was a solid steel rod with no collapsible mechanism, meaning any frontal crash drove it directly into the driver's torso like a spear. And the steering wheel itself, large and rigid, was often the last thing a driver saw before being thrown forward into it. Seatbelts, of course, didn't exist. Occupants were entirely unrestrained, free to be flung into the glass, the dash, or out of the car entirely. The Champion's light weight, once praised for its economy, made it dangerously unstable at highway speeds. The combination of soft suspension, narrow tires, and a high center of gravity created a tendency to lose traction during quick maneuvers. Drivers who swerved suddenly to avoid a pedestrian, an animal, or a pothole often found themselves in uncontrollable fishtails or rollovers. During rollovers, the thin roof pillars provided almost no protection. The roof could collapse within seconds under the car's own weight, crushing passengers who had no seatbelts or roll cages to keep them safe. The brakes were another weak link. The Champion used drum brakes that were barely adequate for its modest weight, but on long descents or repeated stops, they overheated and faded rapidly. Many owners complained that the car's stopping power disappeared like smoke on a hill. In wet conditions, the brakes became even less reliable, something especially terrifying in an era without power assistance or anti-lock systems. Combine poor braking with its unpredictable handling and thin steel shell, and you had a car that turned small mistakes into fatal events. Studebaker's marketing was tragically ironic in light of all this. First by far with the post-war car they boasted, when the redesigned 1947 Champion hit the market. And it was indeed modern, the first true American car to wear a fully new body after World War II. Its sleek bullet-nose front and streamlined silhouette were decades ahead of their time, inspiring admiration from the public and envy from competitors. But the styling hit a harsh truth. All that futuristic design had ignored the most basic principles of occupant safety. The Champion was a car obsessed with looking advanced, but it was engineered with the same pre-war disregard for human vulnerability. Owners who survived serious crashes often spoke about how deceiving the car was. One 1951 Champion owner in California wrote to his local paper after a highway accident saying, "I thought it was a miracle machine until I saw the firewall in my lap. I got out by crawling through the broken windshield, and I've never driven one since." Others noted how the car took the hit, but so did we, a phrase that summed up the paradox of the Champion's structure: strong enough to hold together, but too strong to keep its passengers alive. It's worth remembering that in its day, the Studebaker Champion was a well-intentioned car. It was designed by people who wanted to make something beautiful, efficient, and affordable for the common man. But they lived in a time when safety simply wasn't part of the automotive vocabulary. Manufacturers built cars that looked fast, not cars that could survive being fast. And Studebaker, an independent automaker struggling to stay relevant against the big three, couldn't afford to invest in unproven safety experiments like padded dashboards or reinforced frames. They gave the world a gorgeous, streamlined machine and, unknowingly, one of the deadliest mid-century sedans ever sold. By the early 1950s, when crash testing and safety analysis began to take hold in the industry, the Champion was already outdated and unsafe by emerging standards. It was replaced by newer models that offered slightly more reinforcement and eventually safety glass and better steering columns. But for more than a decade, the Champion roamed American roads like a hidden danger, sleek, stylish, and utterly unprepared for impact.
The Buick Roadmaster of 1946 to 1952 stood as one of America's proudest post-war symbols, a gleaming monument to prosperity, prestige, and power. To the American public, it represented everything a luxury automobile should be: long, wide, heavy, and full of chrome. Buick's marketing promised smooth power and mastery of the open road. And indeed, few cars of the era could match its presence. The sweeping fenders, waterfall grille, and whisper-quiet straight-eight engine gave it an almost regal air. Yet, beneath that polished grandeur lurked one of the most dangerous designs of its time. For all its dignity, the Roadmaster was a brutal reminder of how little manufacturers in the 1940s understood about safety. The car's immense size, rigid body, and outdated engineering turned any serious crash into a fatal event.
At over 2 tons, the Roadmaster was a giant, nearly 215 inches long, with a curb weight that rivaled small trucks. Its body-on-frame construction gave it an illusion of strength, but that strength was deceptive. The frame was rigid to the point of cruelty. It didn't crumble or absorb impact. In a collision, all the energy went directly into the passenger compartment. The heavy front end, dominated by a massive straight-eight engine and reinforced with thick crossmembers, became a solid battering ram in frontal crashes. When the car struck another vehicle or a stationary object, the unyielding frame transmitted the shock straight through the firewall and steering column, crushing whoever sat behind the wheel. That steering column was one of the most notorious death traps of the era. In those pre-safety decades, the idea of a collapsible steering shaft was still years away. Buick engineers, focusing on refinement and precision, mounted the steering wheel on a long, solid steel rod directly connected to the steering box near the front axle. This meant that in any moderate front-end collision, the entire shaft could be pushed backward into the driver's chest with terrifying force. Many post-crash reports described the wheel driven into the driver's sternum or ribs, sometimes fatally. Doctors of the day referred grimly to these injuries as steering column impalements, and in the Roadmaster, they were tragically common. The interior, while luxurious by mid-century standards, was another silent assassin. The dashboard was an expansive slab of solid steel dressed up in gleaming chrome. Buick proudly advertised its aircraft-inspired control layout, rows of bright knobs and switches across the dash, all surrounded by polished trim. But in an accident, that beautiful trim became a weapon. The force of even a low-speed crash could throw occupants forward into the dash, and the hard metal edges could tear through flesh or break bones. Before the age of padded dashboards, these cars were lined with danger. Each control knob a potential laceration, each decorative bezel a blade in disguise. Seatbelts, of course, were non-existent. Passengers were held in place by nothing more than gravity and luck. During crashes or sudden stops, they were thrown violently forward into the glass or dashboard. The large bench seats, upholstered in slippery fabric, offered no lateral support, so even hard cornering could send people sliding across the cabin. The steering wheel itself was an enormous, thin-rimmed circle of rigid bakelite, more like a ship's wheel than a modern control device, and it offered no give upon impact. To make matters worse, the wide interior and high dashboard created the illusion of safety. Drivers felt secure in such a massive vehicle, but that sense of invulnerability only encouraged faster, riskier driving, a deadly mix with 1940s braking and suspension technology. And the Roadmaster's weight, which gave it that comforting sense of solidity, was its curse. It was a front-heavy car, with nearly 60% of its mass over the nose. The heavy inline-8 engine and huge cast-iron transmission made the front end plow mercilessly through corners. Buick's engineers worked hard to give the car Dynaflow smoothness, but that softness came at the cost of stability. The suspension wallowed in turns, the steering was vague, and the bias-ply tires provided little grip. If the driver misjudged a curve or tried to correct too abruptly, the weight transfer could cause the rear end to swing violently, often sending the car into a rollover. At highway speeds, those rollovers were almost always fatal. Inside, survival was a matter of pure chance. The roof structure was thin, designed more for aesthetics than for strength. The thick pillars that appeared solid from the outside were mostly hollow, offering no real rollover protection. In accidents, the roof could collapse inward, crushing the occupants instantly. Survivors often described seeing the metal roof fold like a tent as the windshield shattered into 1,000 deadly fragments. And because laminated safety glass was not yet standard, those shards of glass behaved like knives, slicing into anyone unlucky enough to be thrown forward. The brakes, though advanced for their day, were dangerously inadequate for such a heavy machine. The Buick's large drum brakes overheated easily, fading on long descents or repeated stops. Contemporary testers complained that the car seems to remember it should stop only after you'd already reached the intersection. Once the brakes heated up, pedal pressure increased dramatically, and stopping distances could double. With no power assist in earlier models and no redundancy systems, losing brake efficiency at highway speeds often meant disaster. Even the Roadmaster's weight distribution affected its crash dynamics in deadly ways. The massive front engine and long hood created a pendulum effect during collisions. The front would stop abruptly, but the rear continued to swing, twisting the frame and sending passengers sideways. The steering linkage could collapse under this torsion, trapping the steering wheel at an angle as the car spun. Drivers frequently found themselves unable to steer or brake effectively in emergencies, a terrifying prospect when piloting 2 tons of steel and chrome. Despite these flaws, the Roadmaster's reputation remained golden in its time. It was a car of the elite. Doctors, bankers, and businessmen loved it for its presence and smoothness. It symbolized post-war prosperity, the victory of American industry, and the belief that bigger was always better. Few questioned its safety because safety simply wasn't part of the cultural conversation. The bigger and heavier a car was, the safer people assumed it to be. It wasn't until the 1950s that crash testing and accident research began to challenge that illusion, revealing that cars like the Roadmaster were among the deadliest on the road. Some drivers lived to tell the tale, and they didn't mince words. A 1950 owner from Illinois wrote to Motor Trend describing his near-death crash. "The steering wheel came straight at me like a cannonball. I broke 2 ribs, lost my front teeth, and the doctor said I'd been sitting an inch closer, it would have pierced my heart." Another survivor in California recounted losing control on a mountain curve. "When it rolled, the roof came down like a trapdoor. My wife crawled out through the broken windshield. We were lucky, but we never drove a Buick again." The tragic irony of the Buick Roadmaster's name cannot be overstated. It was a car built to dominate the road, to glide imperiously from city to countryside, but it gave its drivers a false sense of mastery. In truth, it was a beautiful but ungovernable beast, elegant at a standstill, terrifying in motion, and merciless in a crash. It mastered the road until the road fought back. Today, collectors prize the Roadmaster for its grandeur and craftsmanship, unaware of the danger that once hid beneath its shining chrome. Its name still evokes nostalgia, the post-war optimism of wide highways and endless horizons. But for the unlucky few who learned the hard way, the name Roadmaster had a cruel double meaning. Not a ruler of the road, but a master that ruled its driver, often fatally. It was the quintessential American paradox of the 1940s: strength without safety, luxury without mercy, and beauty that could kill as swiftly as it captivated.
The Packard Clipper, produced between 1941 and 1947, represents a paradox of American automotive history. A car celebrated for elegance and style, yet notorious for its deadly flaws. At its debut, the Clipper was hailed as revolutionary. Its design was a departure from the stodgy upright sedans that dominated the era. Long, low, streamlined, with graceful curves that seemed to glide through the air even when standing still. Interiors were plush, upholstered in fine leathers and fabrics, with Art Deco flourishes, chrome accents, and a level of craftsmanship that rivaled Cadillac and Lincoln. To the casual observer, it was the perfect post-war automobile, sophisticated, modern, and aspirational. But beneath the veneer of luxury, the Clipper hid structural deficiencies so severe they turned each collision into a potentially lethal event. The Clipper was built on a rigid steel frame that, while seemingly solid, did not incorporate crumple zones or any form of energy absorption. Engineers at Packard were proud of the rigidity, believing it contributed to a secure and stable ride. In reality, this stiffness meant that in a collision, every ounce of kinetic energy was transferred directly into the occupants. The steering column, A solid steel rod was unforgiving. In head-on collisions, it could pierce the driver's chest, while the dashboard's chrome trim sliced and punctured like shrapnel. Even the seats, with their tubular frames and heavy cushions, could bend and impale passengers when struck with force. Owners who survived Clipper accidents often recounted with horror how the car, which felt luxurious and reassuring in everyday driving, instantly became a cage of steel in a crash. Braking was another Achilles heel. The hydraulic brakes, a feature Packard touted as advanced, were prone to failure when subjected to repeated stops or high-speed driving. Pedals would sink unexpectedly, leaving drivers helpless while a car of nearly 2 tons continued on its trajectory. The Clipper's weight also exaggerated its handling issues. At high speeds, the steering became vague and unresponsive, and any sudden maneuver could induce catastrophic oversteer or a rollover. Combined with the rigid body, the Clipper's design was unforgiving. Minor mistakes often had fatal consequences. Contemporary accounts reveal stories of drivers crushed in relatively low-speed collisions, or families ejected into the metal interior during what should have been minor accidents. Mechanics even coined grim nicknames, the coffin on wheels and the Packard trap, highlighting the stark contrast between the car's elegant image and its real-world danger. Despite these perils, the Clipper was beloved by its owners for its style, comfort, and refinement. Many overlooked its hidden hazards, entranced by the smooth ride, luxurious finishes, and the prestige that came with owning a Packard. Dealerships and advertisements emphasized beauty and modernity while providing no warning of the structural shortcomings. When accidents occurred, it was too late. The car's beauty had become its curse. One 1948 letter to a newspaper recounted a minor collision where the front crumpled inward, sending passengers sprawling into the steering column. Yet the author still described the interior as the finest leather and chrome I have ever touched, encapsulating the duality of the Clipper experience. In addition to structural dangers, the Clipper's post-war production faced economic and engineering pressures. Raw material shortages and a rush to meet pent-up demand after World War II meant corners were cut in critical areas. Body panels were thin, welds inconsistent, and assembly methods often outdated. While the car looked modern and cohesive, it was fundamentally fragile in terms of occupant protection. Over time, the Clipper developed a reputation among safety-conscious mechanics and drivers as a car that could not be trusted in emergencies. Insurance records from the era show disproportionately high claims associated with structural failures, steering column injuries, and brake-related incidents. Even today, surviving Clippers are prized by collectors, but the shadow of danger lingers. Restorations often focus not only on aesthetics, but also on subtly reinforcing structures to make the cars drivable without courting death. The Clipper stands as a haunting reminder of an era when style and luxury were prioritized over safety. A car so beautiful it captivated the imagination, yet so unforgiving that it could turn beauty into brutality in an instant. It is a testament to Packard's ambition and simultaneously a cautionary tale about how elegance and engineering can be tragically at odds. The Clipper, with its sweeping lines, luxurious interior, and lethal weaknesses, is remembered not just as a classic car, but as a symbol of the delicate balance between design, performance, and human life. A car that looked like a dream, but drove like a warning.
The Cadillac Series 62, produced between 1941 and 1949, was the epitome of post-war American luxury. A car that radiated prestige, power, and sophistication. Its sweeping fenders, gleaming chrome, and elegant two-tone paint jobs made it instantly recognizable on the streets of mid-century America.
Inside, the cabin was a shrine to opulence: soft leather seats, polished wood accents, ornate chrome handles, and gleaming instrument panels that looked more like fine jewelry than automotive controls. For the wealthy owner, it was a statement of success, a moving palace that combined American engineering bravado with unparalleled comfort. But beneath this veneer of refinement lay an undercurrent of danger that often went unnoticed until it was too late. At nearly 4,500 pounds for a standard sedan, and even heavier for coupes and convertibles, the Series 62 was a literal behemoth. Its massive weight, combined with a rigid body-on-frame construction and almost zero energy-absorbing crumple zones, made collisions catastrophic. In the event of a crash, the sheer momentum of the vehicle would propel occupants forward with frightening force, and the car's hard, ornate interior left little to cushion the impact. Steering columns were solid steel, dashboards were adorned with sharp chrome edges, and knobs, buttons, and handles protruded dangerously into the cabin space. A minor front-end collision could result in the driver's chest meeting the unyielding steering column, while passengers could be flung against polished wood and hard leather with devastating effect. The mechanical aspects of the Series 62 added another layer of risk. Brakes were hydraulic but primitive by modern standards, prone to fade under heavy use, especially at high speeds or on long descents. The car's long wheelbase and heavy mass made emergency maneuvers sluggish. Steering required significant effort, and responsiveness lagged far behind what drivers would expect today. In tight situations, even a minor miscalculation could send the vehicle careening off course, and with little in the way of restraint systems, seatbelts were rare and often optional, occupants were left almost entirely at the mercy of physics. In urban traffic or on winding country roads, the car's combination of power and unpredictability made every drive a calculated risk. Despite these hazards, Cadillac marketed the Series 62 as the pinnacle of automotive achievement, emphasizing luxury, smoothness, and the status it conferred rather than safety. Owners often became so enamored with the car's prestige and presence that they overlooked its dangers. Many period advertisements highlighted the car's glide over the road and power without effort, but none mentioned that a collision could transform this very luxury into a lethal trap. Historians and automotive safety researchers looking back at the era note that the Series 62, along with other large American sedans of the 1940s, contributed to a surprisingly high rate of severe injuries in traffic accidents, despite its imposing stature. The Cadillac Series 62 also embodied a psychological hazard. Its grandeur and smooth handling gave a false sense of control, encouraging higher speeds and riskier driving. Owners might have assumed that its size and luxury made it safer than smaller vehicles, not realizing that the weight worked against them in a crash. The car's exterior elegance, long hood, sleek roofline, and expansive chrome, belied the deadly reality that inside there was virtually no forgiveness for error. Even the smallest collision could turn into a scenario with dire consequences, where style and comfort became instruments of injury rather than protection. Collectors today still prize surviving Series 62s for their beauty, craftsmanship, and historical significance. Restored models gleam as they did in their heyday, offering a glimpse into an era when automotive design prioritized aesthetics and luxury above almost everything else. Yet for those aware of its history, each polished chrome edge, each solid steel steering column, and every gleaming knob serves as a reminder of just how hazardous life behind the wheel could be in the 1940s. The Cadillac Series 62 remains a paradox, a car of tremendous beauty, refinement, and status, but one that could turn from a symbol of success to a silent killer in the blink of an eye. It stands as both a testament to American post-war luxury and a cautionary tale about the dark side of elegance on wheels.
The Nash Ambassador, produced between 1941 and 1948,
represented an ambitious attempt by Nash Motors to combine style, innovation, and luxury during a tumultuous period in American automotive history. Its designers aimed for sleek, aerodynamic lines, long, sweeping fenders, and a low, elegant profile that would make it stand out in a market still dominated by boxy utilitarian cars. On the surface, it looked like a modern marvel. Smooth curves, generous chrome trim, and interiors designed for comfort and elegance. But beneath this attractive exterior lay a vehicle whose very design made it a silent hazard on the road. At nearly 4,000 pounds, the Ambassador was no lightweight, yet its engineering failed to account for the safety challenges that came with such mass. The long protruding front end, intended to emphasize style and aerodynamics, made the chassis unusually flexible and prone to instability in collisions. In frontal crashes, the massive hood could buckle, fold, or detach entirely, effectively turning it into a steel guillotine aimed directly at the windshield. Occupants in the front seats were particularly vulnerable, with little protection from the rigid dashboard and steering assembly. The interior, while plush and meticulously finished with leather and polished wood accents, offered no padding or energy-absorbing structures, leaving passengers at the mercy of inertia and the unforgiving metal of the car itself. The Ambassador's mechanical systems did little to mitigate its inherent risks. Its steering was notoriously vague, requiring constant attention to keep the car on course, and its drum brakes were underpowered for its substantial weight. Under sudden stops, especially at higher speeds, the brakes could fade quickly, turning a potentially minor hazard into a major accident. The car's suspension, designed more for comfort than control, contributed to a floaty, unpredictable ride. Drivers often described it as sailing a sofa across the road. Pleasant in calm conditions, but terrifying when evasive maneuvers were required. On winding country roads or in urban traffic, the Ambassador's size and lack of responsive handling could make even experienced drivers feel outmatched. Historical accounts from the era paint a stark picture of the consequences. Minor collisions often resulted in serious injuries due to the lack of crumple zones and rigid construction, while the long hood and heavy front made rollovers particularly dangerous. Anecdotal reports from owners note that sudden braking could send passengers forward violently, and the steering column, solid and unyielding, had the potential to pierce the chest in severe accidents. Despite its elegance, every design choice prioritized style over safety, leaving the Ambassador as both a status symbol and a deadly gamble on the road. Yet the Nash Ambassador was not without merit. Its attempt at aerodynamic styling foreshadowed trends that would dominate post-war automotive design, and it offered a level of comfort and refinement unusual for American cars of the early 1940s. Owners prized its roomy interiors, cushioned seats, and the quiet dignity of its cabin, where meticulous attention to detail made long journeys luxurious. But these virtues were always shadowed by the car's fundamental flaws. The very features that made it attractive, long hood, flexible chassis, and elegant proportions, were the ones that amplified danger, turning beauty into a latent threat. Today, the Nash Ambassador is remembered as an ambitious, visually striking car whose engineering could not match its aesthetic aspirations. Collectors admire it for its styling and historical significance, but any discussion of its legacy must include the sobering reality of its hazards. Driving an Ambassador was a study in contradictions, a journey of elegance, comfort, and forward-thinking design, constantly tempered by the risk that one wrong move could transform the luxurious experience into a violent encounter with steel. In many ways, it stands as a stark reminder of an era when automotive ambition often outpaced the science of safety, leaving drivers to navigate both the road and the inherent perils of their own vehicle.
The Kaiser Special, manufactured between 1947 and 1950, occupies a strange and cautionary place in American automotive history. Emerging from the ambitious minds of Henry J. Kaiser and Joseph W. Frazier, the company sought to disrupt the dominance of the Big Three, Ford, GM, and Chrysler, by offering modern, stylish vehicles that combined innovation with affordability. At a time when Americans were recovering from the devastation of World War II, the Kaiser Special seemed like a breath of fresh air, a car that promised elegance, practicality, and forward-thinking design without the heavy price tag of Detroit's top-end sedans. Its styling was undeniably striking for its era. Rounded fenders, expansive curved windshields, minimal chrome accents, and a clean, flowing body profile made it appear far more sophisticated than the boxy post-war sedans flooding the market. Inside, the car boasted wide bench seats, ample legroom, and a trim level that suggested luxury. Soft fabrics, tasteful dashboards, and user-friendly controls gave it a sense of refinement unusual for its price range. However, beneath this visually appealing exterior lurked a host of deadly engineering flaws that would define the Kaiser Special's legacy. The car's body was built with recycled steel of inconsistent quality, often brittle and prone to failure under stress. Welding standards were inconsistent, leaving seams that could literally tear apart in even moderate collisions. The unibody construction, advanced in concept and lighter than traditional body-on-frame designs, lacked critical reinforcement in key structural areas. In accidents, the cabin could collapse inward with terrifying speed, exposing passengers to twisted steel and shards of brittle glass. Steering components, especially the early steering boxes, were notoriously unreliable. Reports from early owners and accident investigators indicated that the steering could seize mid-turn, locking the front wheels and making the car uncontrollable, a terrifying scenario for any driver, especially at highway speeds. The suspension and braking systems compounded the danger. The drum brakes, common for the era, were underpowered relative to the car's weight, and their performance degraded quickly under repeated or heavy use. The front suspension, while offering a relatively smooth ride over the rudimentary roads of the late 1940s, could buckle under stress, causing the car to veer unpredictably. Owners described a vague, floaty steering feel combined with a nervous chassis that twisted and flexed unnervingly. Minor collisions could become catastrophic due to the combination of weak structural integrity, poorly reinforced passenger compartments, and unyielding metal interiors. The steering wheel, mounted on a solid shaft, was another hazard. In a frontal collision, it could penetrate the driver's torso like a spear. Early safety investigators were appalled. One report described the Kaiser Special as catastrophically unstable, citing repeated failures in steering, suspension, braking, and body rigidity. Even minor accidents could result in severe injuries or fatalities, a reality that contrasted starkly with the car's polished, modern appearance. In essence, the Kaiser Special offered all the allure of a post-war innovation, stylish looks, comfortable seating, and relative fuel efficiency, while presenting risks that far outweighed its benefits. Owners had to navigate not just the roads, but the car itself, aware that it could twist, jam, or fail without warning. Despite its shortcomings, the Kaiser Special reflected a bold vision of American post-war ambition. It was a car built to demonstrate that a newcomer could challenge Detroit's giants, offering design, innovation, and practicality at an accessible price. Yet its very ambition became its undoing. The rush to market, combined with inadequate engineering and material quality, meant that every aesthetic triumph came with a lethal counterpart. Drivers experienced a precarious balance. They sat in a cabin that promised modernity and elegance, yet could collapse catastrophically at the slightest provocation. Today, surviving Kaiser Specials are incredibly rare, often preserved by collectors who appreciate their historical significance rather than their practicality. The car serves as a stark reminder that innovation without rigorous engineering and safety oversight can be fatal. Its story is a lens into a time when ambition, optimism, and post-war enthusiasm collided with technological inexperience, leaving behind a vehicle that was as dangerous as it was beautiful. In retrospect, the Kaiser Special isn't just a footnote in automotive history, it's a cautionary tale about the deadly consequences of prioritizing style and novelty over safety and reliability.
Its legacy is a haunting juxtaposition of elegance and peril, a car that could impress on the showroom floor while quietly threatening the lives of its passengers on the road. The Kaiser Special remains an emblem of ambition gone awry, a car that symbolizes both the promise and peril of post-war American automotive experimentation. It teaches that beauty and innovation are meaningless without structural integrity and occupant protection. Even decades later, it stands as a chilling example of how a vehicle can captivate the eye and horrify the drivers simultaneously.